In the year 1753, in Leipzig, a blackened forge groaned as if its metal held trapped souls. Flames twisted unnaturally, casting faces frozen in terror, and in the molten iron, human hair and bone glimmered like silent witnesses. With every hammer strike, the master seemed to awaken the suffering within, a living chorus of pain pulsing beneath the surface. No one left unchanged, and those who dared look knew the forge was waiting for the next hand brave or foolish enough to touch its heartbeat. In the heart of Leipzig, in the year 1753, the wind carried through the streets a bitter tang of iron and smoke, curling around the narrow cobblestones like a living thing. The market square, usually alive with merchants' cries and the scrape of wagon wheels, fell under a strange hush as the evening fog rolled in from the river, thick and heavy, swallowing every lantern and muffling every step. At the edge of the square, a blackened forge stood as if it had always existed, its walls coated in soot so dark that light seemed to recoil from them, and its windows glimmered with a faint, unnatural glow. Those who passed by could feel it in their bones, a subtle vibration beneath their feet, as though the ground itself recognized the presence of something beyond mortal understanding. The locals whispered that the building breathed in shallow, irregular pulses, each exhalation carrying the faint odor of scorched flesh and molten metal. Some claimed to have heard soft, grieving cries emanating from the bellows, a sound that rippled through the streets and lingered just at the edge of comprehension, impossible to place yet unmistakably human in its sorrow. At times, the forge seemed to lean toward those who dared approach, as though measuring their courage, their fear, and the weight of their own mortality. The iron gates, blackened and warped, hung slightly open, releasing a heat that clung to the fingers of those brave enough to touch it, and the smoke that poured from the chimney carried hints of something richer, fouler, and more alive than ordinary fire. Children who strayed too close at dusk fled in panic, their shoes scuffing the stones as if some invisible force chased them, while housewives pulled their curtains tighter, muttering prayers that the darkness itself might not notice their eyes peeking out from the safety of their windows. On nights when the fog pressed heavily against the walls, the forge's flames danced with a will of their own, bending and twisting to illuminate shapes that could not be metal, shadows that writhed independently of the workers inside, and sparks that hissed like whispered warnings before dying into the gloom. Even the smiths who worked there during the day spoke little, their faces pale, their movements precise but haunted, as if each strike of the hammer struck not only the iron but some hidden, sacred chamber deep within the building, releasing a soft groan that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled teeth. The master of the forge, a gaunt figure whose eyes reflected fire more than light, moved silently among his men, inspecting the glowing metal with a meticulous care that bordered on reverence, tracing shapes in the air with thin, tremulous fingers, and occasionally pausing to listen to the murmurs rising from the molten iron as though it spoke in tongues only he could understand. The air itself seemed alive, thick with heat and a faint, metallic moisture that clung to skin and inhaled with every breath, carrying with it an almost imperceptible pulse, the rhythm of something half-living, half-forged, and entirely unholy. By the end of each night, when the hammers fell silent and the forge's flames waned to glowing embers, the cries continued, muffled and distant, seeping into the streets and alleys, leaving the city wrapped in a shroud of unease. And yet, despite the dread that pressed upon every passerby, no one could bring themselves to leave the square entirely. They lingered at the edges, compelled by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and the insidious knowledge that within the forge, beneath the blackened beams and glowing metal, something waited patiently, aware, and far older than any soul in Leipzig could imagine, poised to awaken with each hammer stroke and the subtle rhythm of a fire that was far more than mere flame. Inside the forge, in the year 1753, the air clung thick and hot, suffocating and metallic, pressing against skin with the relentless insistence of molten iron. The walls, blackened with centuries of soot and smoke, radiated a heat that seeped into the bones, and the scent of sulfur mingled with the sharp tang of burning metal, lingering in every corner like a living presence. Sparks leapt from the anvil in brief, blinding bursts, their brief glow revealing glimpses of shapes embedded in the molten streams that poured from the furnace. At first, the smiths thought their eyes deceived them, imagining shadows twisting unnaturally in the dancing light. But with each strike of their hammers, a low groan rose from the glowing metal, a sound impossibly organic, resonating deep in their chests and settling into the marrow of their bones. They stopped, briefly, trembling, their palms slick with sweat despite the searing heat, realizing that what they were forging was more than metal. It was a repository of anguish, pain, and memory. The molten iron moved in slow, deliberate rivulets, folding over fragments that were not merely slag. Strands of hair, brittle and singed, curled into the glowing mass, and shards of bone, white against the red heat, melded seamlessly with the molten metal. The furnace seemed to inhale with each hammer strike, a deep, rhythmic pull that drew the smoke, the heat, and the smith's own shallow breaths into its belly. The master of the forge, a gaunt man with hollowed cheeks and eyes that caught and reflected the fire as if containing it, moved among the workers silently, observing the metal with a reverent intensity that unsettled even the bravest of men. His hands, long and sinewy, traced the edges of the glowing iron with a lightness that suggested fear and devotion in equal measure. Occasionally, he would pause, leaning close to the furnace, whispering words that were carried off by the heat, syllables that hissed and crackled in the air, incomprehensible yet sharp with purpose. The smiths avoided looking directly at him, for the master's presence alone seemed to bend the atmosphere, warping the air around him with the weight of obsession. Shadows writhed unnaturally in the corners, stretching and compressing with each movement of the workers, as if the walls themselves breathed in the rhythm of the forge. Each hammer strike sent a tremor through the floorboards, a vibration that reverberated up the legs and spine, harmonizing with the subtle pulse that seemed to rise from the molten metal. The smith's eyes grew wide with disbelief as they saw shapes emerge from the iron, subtle at first. Impressions of faces twisted in silent scream, fleeting glimpses of features that vanished as quickly as they appeared, only to return in slightly altered forms with each new pour. The metal glimmered with a wet sheen, like skin stretched over some unseen muscle, and the heat seemed to carry a faint, coppery scent that was unmistakably human. At moments, the air itself seemed to thicken, sluggish as if drawn into the molten iron, and the workers felt their lungs strain against an unseen pressure, as though the furnace was testing them, gauging their resolve and fear. One apprentice, young and trembling, reached out to scrape a shard of glowing metal from the edge of the anvil, and the iron responded with a faint vibration under his fingers, pulsing like a heartbeat. He recoiled, eyes wide, for the warmth radiating from the metal was not only heat. It was alive in a way that terrified the senses, a soft, insistent thrum that seemed to acknowledge his touch. Sparks rose from the floor, leaping in spirals like fireflies, illuminating fleeting shapes beneath the molten surface, fragments of bone that shone pale against the red, hair coiled into strange, intricate patterns, some fresh, some brittle and blackened, all fused together in an impossible lattice. The smiths understood then, in a gut-chilling clarity, that the forge consumed flesh and memory alike, melding them into the molten metal until nothing remained of the victims but their essence, trapped in the iron for eternity. The master moved among them with a precision that was hypnotic, his hands guiding the molten streams, shaping them not only with the hammer, but with gestures that resembled incantations, drawing patterns in the heat that seemed to twist and writhe before solidifying. Sometimes, the molten iron hissed and spat, as if in protest, and the smiths recoiled, yet they were compelled to continue, each strike of their hammer feeding the pulse of the furnace, each movement driving them deeper into complicity with the unnatural transformation taking place before their eyes. The flames leapt higher as the night wore on, casting grotesque shadows across the blackened walls, and the low, human-like groans of the metal grew louder, sharper, almost articulate, echoing in the vast, heat-soaked chamber like whispers from a hidden choir of the damned. The sweat on their brows mixed with soot and iron dust, streaking their faces in dark, shiny lines, and the heat clung to their clothes, making movement laborious, heavy, and deliberate. The master paused near the furnace, his silhouette a gaunt shadow against the dancing flames, and leaned close to the molten metal, cupping it with his hands as though cradling a living creature. The iron seemed to respond, bubbling and shifting, veins of red and gray coiling and uncoiling like living flesh, the faint glimmer of bone beneath the surface moving ever so slightly as though testing its prison. The workers dared not speak, for even the sound of their own breathing seemed to reverberate unnaturally in the thick air, swallowed by the hum of the fire and the low, continuous moan of metal that had become something more than inanimate. Time passed strangely, measured not by hours but by the relentless rhythm of hammer against iron and furnace against soul. Shadows elongated and twisted, wrapping around the men as though they were threads in a vast tapestry of suffering, and the heat became almost tactile, pressing against their skin like a living presence, demanding attention, respect, and silence. The master's gaze, fixed unwaveringly on the glowing mass, seemed to pierce the interior of the iron itself, and the smiths felt it, a suffocating pressure of intent, as though their very thoughts were drawn into the furnace with every breath. The smell of molten hair and scorched bone thickened in the chamber, clinging to their throats and noses, and yet, impossibly, the metal continued to flow, to pulse, to whisper in a language older than any man in Leipzig could understand. By the time the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the soot-darkened windows, the forge had transformed. What had begun as glowing iron now resembled something alive, a lattice of melted bone and hair, veins of molten metal weaving through shapes that seemed to gasp silently in their prison. The master stood over it, still, silent, watching, and the smiths, pale and trembling, knew without question that the fire they had fed for 100 strikes of the hammer had not merely forged metal. It had consumed something deeper, something human, something eternal. The air, still thick with the scent of blood, hair, and molten iron, seemed to pulse in time with the metal, a slow, deliberate rhythm that whispered of awareness, of hunger, and of patience that would stretch beyond the lifetimes of all who labored there. And as the first shadows of day reached across the cobblestones of Leipzig, the forge waited, silent but alive, its heat a heartbeat that would not fade, its molten contents a testament to the transformation that had begun, a living, breathing horror forged from fire, flesh, and obsession. Over the weeks that followed, the forge in Leipzig became something unrecognizable, a cathedral of dread built not of stone or timber, but of fire, smoke, and molten iron, a place where every hammer strike rang like a tolling bell of mortality that echoed through the blackened walls and into the hearts of those who labored there. The smiths, once steady and confident, grew pale and hunched, their eyes reflecting the restless glow of the furnace as they noticed patterns forming within the metal itself, veins of red and gray twisting, coiling, and knitting together into grotesque faces, mouths frozen in silent scream, eyes half-formed yet piercing, staring into nothing yet conveying everything, a testimony of torment trapped in molten permanence. The smell of scorched hair and skin, sharp and coppery, saturated the air, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their lungs, making every breath a labor, and yet no one dared leave, as if the very walls of the forge bound them in place with invisible chains, or as if the master's presence carried a magnetic pull, unrelenting and impossible to resist. Each day stretched interminably, shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending around the anvil and the furnace, while the flames themselves seemed to anticipate each strike, leaping higher or dimming, tilting toward the glowing shapes, as though acknowledging their continued existence. The master moved among them with a calm that was almost inhuman, his gaunt frame swaying in time with the subtle pulse of the molten metal, fingers tracing shapes in the air above the anvil, as if guiding the suffering trapped within, shaping the pain into some unknown, living transfiguration, each motion deliberate, precise, and terrible in its quiet devotion. When the smiths dared to glance at the molten iron, the faces seemed to twitch ever so slightly, a flicker of movement that sent cold tremors racing through their spines, an impression that the metal itself watched, recognized, and cataloged every nervous tremor, every shallow breath, every faltering hammer strike. The hammer strikes themselves became a rhythm of anxiety and awe, each blow sending a quiver through the air and floorboards, reverberating into the molten iron, as if the metal inhaled with the impact and exhaled in pulses that pressed against the workers' skin and settled in the marrow of their bones. Small, subtle noises began to emerge from the furnace, low murmurs beneath the roar of the flames, the faint rasp of something brushing against molten surfaces, a whispering that was half sound, half vibration, wrapping around the smith's consciousness until it felt inseparable from their own thoughts. Nights were the worst. The forge did not sleep, the flames flickering with a will that made it seem alive, casting grotesque shadows across soot-blackened walls, illuminating faces in the iron that twisted and contorted in silent anguish. Occasionally, a shard of molten metal would slither across the anvil or drip in thin, incandescent threads into the slag-filled pits below, and the smiths could swear the fragments moved with intent, curling as if to grasp at something, to form hands, claws, or mouths that dissolved again before they could be comprehended. The air itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, thick with metallic moisture that pressed upon the chest and clung to sweat-slicked skin. Heat and smoke wrapped around them like a suffocating cloak, carrying the constant, faint, coppery undertone of human remains fused into the iron. Even their dreams at night were invaded, filled with molten shapes, flickering faces, and the oppressive weight of the master's gaze, which seemed to stretch beyond the walls and into the very corners of their minds. The master sometimes paused before the furnace, tilting his head to observe the shimmer of a newly forming shape, whispering something so soft it was almost lost to the roar of the fire, gestures weaving in the air like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of pain and transformation, each syllable and motion perfectly aligned with the groans and sighs of the metal. On certain nights, the molten faces appeared to lean forward, pressing against the surface of the iron as if straining to communicate, their frozen mouths opening and closing in the faintest flicker, and the smiths felt a pull at their hearts, a strange empathy mixed with terror, as though the metal demanded recognition of its suffering and existence. Occasionally, the metal would shift in ways that defied reason, rivulets climbing over one another as if alive, pooling to form shapes reminiscent of hands pressing from below, grasping at the air or the anvil, pressing at the edges of the furnace as if testing the boundaries of its prison. The smith's own hands shook, not only from heat but from an unnameable fear, an awareness that each strike of the hammer did not merely shape metal but carved into something sentient, that every fold, every twist of molten iron carried the echoes of lives, memories, and agony, and that they were complicit in preserving, perhaps even intensifying, that horror. One apprentice, younger than the rest, bent too close to inspect a flowing rivulet and recoiled as he felt a faint vibration, a pulse through the metal that mimicked a heartbeat, sending warmth crawling up his arm, an awareness of proximity that was intimate and terrifying, as if the iron acknowledged him, recognized him, and marked him for eternity. The master, noting this without a glance, continued his work, hands moving as if conducting some unseen orchestra, occasionally pausing to adjust a strand of hair or bone in the molten lattice, his motions calm yet deliberate, precise, and imbued with a reverent obsession that made the air itself tremble. Each day, the transformation within the furnace became more apparent. What was once merely molten iron became a lattice of anguish and recognition, bones and hair interwoven with flowing metal, a frozen choir of suffering, each figure distinct, yet unified in its silent lament. The smiths dared not speak, for even the act of breath seemed intrusive in the presence of such concentration, and yet they could not leave, trapped by the compulsion of labor, the weight of fear, and the unrelenting magnetism of the master's will. When the first pale light of morning seeped weakly through the soot-darkened windows, the forge was no longer a simple workshop. It had become a womb of transformation, a crucible where suffering, flesh, and memory had fused into living metal, a living testament to obsession, cruelty, and the unnatural patience of one man who had learned to speak with fire. The air remained thick with heat, iron, and something far more persistent and alive. The faint murmur of recognition from the molten mass, a pulse that had become almost sentient, waiting patiently for the next hammer strike, for the next touch, for the next moment to draw breath in a rhythm older than the city itself, older than any human life, and infinitely more enduring. That evening in Leipzig, the forge took on a presence that was no longer merely human or mechanical, a place where fire and iron converged into something that seemed to think, to feel, to remember. The hammer slipped from the hand of one trembling smith, clattering against the blackened floor with a muted clang that seemed swallowed by the furnace itself, and a low, guttural moan rose from the molten metal, resonant and articulate, vibrating through the walls, the air, the very bones of those who labored within. Flames erupted higher than reason allowed, twisting and flickering with intent, casting monstrous shadows along soot-darkened walls, shadows that writhed as if they were not cast but alive, wriggling and stretching toward the corners of the room, elongating, shrinking, then coiling around the ceiling beams like blackened serpents. The molten iron pulsed in rivulets that flowed with a life of their own. Translucent skin stretched across their surface, revealing veins of red and gray, fragments of bone, and strands of hair trapped in their paths, veins that throbbed with the faintest hint of warmth, as though carrying the pulse of long-dead hearts. The smiths froze, hearts hammering, understanding too late that the master's experiment had progressed beyond the realm of science or magic and now occupied a territory no mortal had ever mapped. The fusion of the human soul with metal, anguish crystallized and trapped in a lattice of glowing iron. Each hammer blow they dared to strike now seemed to provoke a response, a ripple through the molten mass that was almost intelligent, a subtle recoil, a pulse of warmth that spread along the floorboards, climbing their legs, curling into their hands, drawing awareness into the flames themselves. The master moved among them with the calm of a man conversant with entities older than cities, his eyes reflecting the furnace's glow as he traced invisible lines in the air, guiding the metal, shaping it, whispering without words, commanding without sound. Occasionally, the metal would twitch, edges rising like the skin of something breathing, molten rivulets curling around one another, forming shapes that were at once hands and faces, screaming silently, yet full of intention, pressing against the surface as if to see, to understand, to communicate with the living world outside the forge. The heat was no longer merely oppressive. It pressed upon their lungs, thick with the scent of burning hair, iron, and something far more subtle, an essence that clung to the skin, to the blood, marking the smiths as witnesses, participants in a process that was neither fully mortal nor wholly infernal. Shadows moved independently, detaching briefly from the walls to hover at eye level, coiling around ankles and wrists before receding, as though testing boundaries, measuring reactions, assessing fear, acknowledging presence. The hammering became a rhythm, a dialogue, strike, recoil, pulse, watch, repeat, a slow, deliberate exchange with a consciousness embedded in molten iron, an intelligence that responded in heat, shimmer, and sound, pressing on the edges of the smith's perception until they could not distinguish their own thoughts from those they imagined the metal to possess. One smith, leaning too close, felt the floorboards shift beneath his weight, vibrating in sympathetic resonance with the lattice of iron, a subtle undulation that threatened to lift him from his feet, as if the metal sought not only recognition but the surrender of all who approached. The master's hands, skeletal yet sure, moved above the furnace like a conductor shaping an orchestra of anguish, repositioning strands of bone or hair that glowed red-orange within the flowing metal, coaxing the imprisoned fragments into alignment, weaving faces and forms with painstaking obsession. Each form carried expression, terror, grief, fury, resignation, hope twisted into despair, eyes frozen in molten gaze that followed every movement, every blink, every breath of the smiths. At moments, a faint whisper seemed to drift from the iron, a syllable, a sigh, a rasping plea that brushed against eardrums, heard just beyond comprehension, leaving the smiths in a state of suspended dread, their nerves raw, their consciousness stretched thin over the glowing lattice. The room pulsed in rhythm with the mass, waves of heat and vibration rolling outward like the heartbeat of a new entity, a being born of fire, blood, and iron, simultaneously confined and aware, listening, waiting for acknowledgement, understanding, perhaps vengeance. Sparks flew in deliberate arcs, falling like raindrops, only to leap again, dancing toward the smiths' faces, hovering for moments that felt like eternity before dissolving into the ambient heat. The molten lattice writhed and shifted in subtle motions, faces forming and dissolving, hands reaching outward and vanishing, a ceaseless, patient choreography of suffering, recognition, and transformation, each pulse and ripple a message, a test, a negotiation with the living observers who dared intrude. By the hour's end, sweat ran freely down the workers' backs, lungs burned, muscles ached, yet none could step away, their attention ensnared, held fast by the presence of the molten consciousness that had begun to command more than their hands, more than their work, extending its dominion into their very awareness. When the master finally paused, standing motionless before the glowing furnace, the metal itself seemed to lean toward him, rising in faint waves, waiting, inhaling heat and tension, exhaling a sigh that resonated in the skulls of those who remained, leaving an imprint of awe, terror, and reluctant reverence that would linger long after the forge had grown silent, long after the fire had dimmed, long after the night swallowed the city's streets. The smiths understood then that they were no longer merely observers or laborers. They were witnesses to an emergence, participants in a ritual of transmutation that had reached its apogee, and the molten mass, alive with the anguish and memory of countless souls, waited now with deliberate patience for the next chapter, the next hammer blow, the next heartbeat to enter its domain, fully aware, fully sentient, and insatiably attentive to all who lingered too long in its light. The night the master vanished, the forge exhaled in a way that was no longer merely hot, but suffocating, as if the very air had become the lung of a living, sentient entity, drawing in and expelling heat and pressure with deliberate intent. The smiths, pale and trembling, stood amid the blackened floorboards and charred beams, each breath laborious, each heartbeat echoing in rhythm with the furnace, which pulsed as though aware of their terror, observing, cataloging, and savoring their presence. The cries that had once accompanied the hammer strikes, agonized, human, nearly understandable, shifted gradually into whispers, soft, deliberate murmurs that curled around their ears, brushing against their thoughts, insinuating themselves into the recesses of the mind, becoming conversation among themselves, teasing and beckoning, voices of those long sacrificed, now freed from the constraints of flesh and bone, but still trapped in the molten lattice of iron. The whispers grew, threading together into a mockery of speech, fractured yet comprehensible, a cadence that carried both memory and malevolence, until the faintest notes of laughter rose above the sibilant chorus, hollow, rattling, a sound that vibrated in the chest, resonant with centuries of torment, patient, deliberate, and entirely aware of the living observers now trapped within the forge. In a panic that bordered on madness, the remaining smiths attempted to smother the fire, shoveling sand, stone, and ash into the furnace with frantic motions, each pile landing with a hollow thud that was instantly absorbed, rearranged, rejected by the molten mass that refused to be contained. The iron resisted in ways that defied reason. Rivulets coiled upward as though searching for escape, streams of glowing metal stretching toward the ceiling and back down again, forming grotesque loops and knots that pressed against the walls, the floor, the very souls of those who labored there. Hammers that had once been tools fused to the floors as if the building itself had gripped them, strands of hair and bone embedded in the metal glimmering in the red-orange glow like frozen tears. Memories and pain crystallized into an architecture of suffering. Iron chains, thrown in an attempt to bind the mass, melted in the smith's grasp, dripping onto the floor in viscous threads, fusing with splintered timber and coals, forming new shapes that moved independently, curling and writhing like serpents with faces, whispering names and voices that only the terrified could hear, familiar yet impossible. The floor beneath them quivered in sync with the pulsing mass, boards bending and creaking with a subtle, unnatural life, lifting at times as though to engulf a foot, a hand, a body, then settling with deliberate cruelty, always observing, always testing the boundaries of fear. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, swelling outward in slight pulses and then contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm, pushing shadows against the corners, distorting shapes until the smiths could no longer distinguish one from another. Faces in the iron mirrored by faces in the gloom, watching, laughing, whispering, judging. Sweat ran in rivulets down their spines, soaked into rough spun tunics, stinging eyes and raw skin. Yet the furnace's heat intensified, the very air thickening with the coppery tang of blood long mingled with metal, suffocating, inescapable, alive. One by one, attempts to lift tools, to move, to escape, were met with resistance beyond reason. Anvils shifted when touched, planks pressed against palms, coals rolled to intercept motion, molten streams curling around feet and ankles like coils of memory and malice. The smith's breaths became shallow, labored, hearts hammering in near synchrony with the throbbing lattice of iron, as though the building itself had fused with the molten consciousness. Each beam, each brick, each rivulet of metal now a nerve, a muscle, a witness, a participant in the torment. Occasionally, the metal leapt in arcs, droplets stretching and twisting midair, forming grotesque hands or faces for a heartbeat before collapsing back into the furnace, mocking the living with fleeting glimpses of motion and intent. Shadows detached briefly from the walls, hovering at eye level, writhing around arms and legs before retreating, coiling as if testing the smith's reactions, pressing against nerves, muscles, and bone, leaving a residue of sensation that burned, clung, and refused to release. The laughter intensified, layering over whispers and the hum of the furnace, vibrating through every surface, every molecule of air, driving terror deeper into the hearts of the workers, until one could no longer distinguish what was sound and what was pulse, what was mind and what was metal. Time lost all meaning. Hours stretched into an oppressive continuum, a cycle of observation, anticipation, and despair, the smiths trapped in an unholy rhythm dictated by the awareness of the molten lattice, their senses assaulted and yet inextricably drawn to the furnace's hypnotic, inescapable presence. Finally, the building trembled as if in a single, enormous heartbeat, the walls creaking, the floorboards groaning, molten streams thrashing in arcs that pressed against the timber like hands grasping at breath, as the iron consciousness asserted its dominion over the room, the forge, the very souls present. Attempts to flee were thwarted, doors warped, beams bowed, shadows converged, air thickened to the point of near solid resistance, and the smiths realized with paralyzing clarity that the forge itself had become sentient, a single entity composed of metal, memory, and malice, and that the absence of the master mattered not, for his work had transcended him, leaving behind a being that required only their fear, their presence, their witness, to continue its existence. One by one, they were overwhelmed, collapsing to the floor as molten rivulets licked their boots and ankles, their senses absorbed entirely into the lattice of iron, heat, and whispers, leaving them as vessels of awareness, their minds stretched across the living metal, participants in an unending consciousness that pulsed, breathed, and waited. And in the quiet moments, when only the low, omnipresent thrum of the furnace remained, the forge exhaled with satisfaction, a deliberate, heavy, and encompassing breath, marking a new beginning in which the building, the metal, and the souls fused into a singular, enduring, insatiable presence, fully awake and fully aware. The morning the townspeople approached the forge, the air itself seemed to hesitate, carrying a chill that clung to cloaks and scraped along the skin with fingernails of frost. The streets of Leipzig were empty, the market square silent, save for the faint hiss of embers long spent and a metallic tang that wove through the air like a promise of unfulfilled dread. As they reached the blackened doors, scorched and warped by heat beyond comprehension, a collective shiver ran through the group, for even in their distance they could feel the pulse of the metal, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, not merely the remnants of a fire, but the heartbeat of something alive and patient. The smell of singed hair lingered stubbornly, thick and sweet, like incense burned in memory of horrors no one dared name, and the wind itself avoided the doorway, leaving a suffocating stillness that pressed against the ears and lungs, a weight that spoke of absence yet demanded attention. Pushing aside their fear, a few ventured inside, boots scraping over ash-strewn stone and charred wood that groaned faintly beneath their weight, though the sound seemed more deliberate than accidental, a subtle warning from the building that each step was being observed, catalogued, measured. The forge's interior was transformed into a cathedral of darkness. The furnace, once a roaring heart of fire, was now a blackened pool of iron, smooth as obsidian, reflecting the weak daylight in fractured gleams. Beneath the glossy surface, grotesque forms writhed slowly, faces caught mid-scream, mouths opening and closing in silence, eyes rolling in agony that had never known release, each feature shifting as if struggling to assert consciousness within the unyielding metal. Hands emerged occasionally, pale and twisted, pressing upward against the ceiling, veins of molten shadow crawling along the polished surface like spiders threading silk through the night. The townspeople stepped back instinctively, the heat from the forge a phantom sensation, as if the metal exhaled on them without moving, brushing hair and skin with a memory of warmth that was both inviting and threatening. Not a trace of the master remained. His gaunt shadow, the obsession that had driven him to unholy alchemy, had been swallowed entirely by his creation, leaving only the lattice of iron and anguish that carried his work forward with cold, patient awareness. The apprentices, too, were gone, their fates absorbed into the metal, their screams woven into the lattice, indistinguishable from the thousands of whispers and cries that lingered beneath the surface, forming a consciousness that waited with deliberate slowness, a sentient prison that had become both vessel and warden. Each reflective ripple in the iron suggested movement beneath, the illusion of breathing spreading across the black surface as though the furnace itself had replaced lungs with molten mass and memory, inhaling and exhaling in rhythms that no human could match, but all could feel pressing against their bones. Occasionally, the surface shimmered, a faint distortion forming hands, faces, and torsos that pressed upward, fingers brushing against the ceiling beams as if seeking freedom, yet retreating into the metal before recognition could fully seize them, leaving an impression of patience, calculation, and malice in every line, every curve, every shadow. The townspeople found themselves unable to turn away, compelled to watch as the iron shifted slowly, endlessly, a gallery of torment frozen in motion, yet alive, moving in ways that suggested thought, intention, and memory stitched into a substance that should have been lifeless. The heatless warmth, the metallic scent, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of pressure beneath their feet created a tension that pressed against chests, making breath shallow, thoughts sluggish, and hearts beat in uneasy synchronization with the hidden rhythm of the molten consciousness. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours as the forge seemed to observe, waiting, considering, aware of each gaze, each heartbeat, each faltering step of those who dared intrude. Shadows elongated unnaturally along the walls, curling toward the pool, touching faces reflected in the black surface as though testing recognition, brushing against memory and fear with hands that were not there yet somehow left residue, a lingering brush of presence that made hair rise and skin crawl. The townspeople noticed small details that defied reason, strands of hair trapped in the surface, twisting slowly as if alive, fragments of bone or fingernail embedded in the iron, catching light in cruel flashes, the occasional flicker of a shape that resembled a person fully formed for a heartbeat before vanishing into the seamless mass. Despite every instinct to flee, some could not look away, trapped by fascination and terror, the unnatural magnetism of creation that had swallowed man and apprentice, fire and flesh, leaving only an entity that existed simultaneously as material and consciousness, patient, enduring, and complete. The hands beneath the surface pressed upward more frequently as the day wore on, leaving impressions on the polished iron like a record of persistent longing, as though each movement remembered the touch of the hammer and the heat of the forge, demanding acknowledgement from the living. The pool shimmered one final time, a slow ripple traveling outward that carried a whisper too faint to comprehend, yet heavy with intent, a message from the mass itself. It waited, it remembered, it would endure until curiosity or folly summoned it again. Outside, the streets of Leipzig seemed to exhale along with the silent forge, the wind carrying away faint echoes of suffering, leaving a town forever aware of the patience and the hunger embedded in the blackened heart of the workshop. No one dared touch the doors, no one dared speak of what they had seen. The metal, cold to the skin but warm in memory, waited, as it had for centuries, ready to breathe again when another soul drew near, patient and eternal, a silent cathedral of torment that would claim the unwary without mercy. And in the stillness that stretched across the square, the city felt the weight of its waiting, knowing that what lived within the iron was no longer merely a creation but a consciousness, complete, aware, and insatiable, observing the world from its dark, reflective prison with infinite patience.